So first of all, Diana and also Cindy, many, many thanks for organizing this. It's been a wonderful event. Happy birthday, Jed. Many, 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 many more. I'm already waiting for the 80th one. I had a homework assignment, basically, which was somehow to summarize the conference. I'm going to need a Knob Creek 120 proof, molecular biology proof bourbon to do that. I'm ready. Not the Jed wine, the molecular bio bourbon. So it's also to talk about where we've been and where we're going. There are many, many songs going through my head, like Dido's Lament from Dido and Aeneas, Turn Out the Lights, The Party's Over for country music. So I want to be brief because I think many of you have infinitely more intelligent things to say than I do, but I thought I would basically talk about the conference and also where I think or where I hope maybe the discipline might be going or perhaps should go. I'm a pessimist by nature because I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan. They never won a damn Super Bowl, and I live in New Jersey, so it's, I was born in New Jersey. The last about 10 years, I've been asking many people about what they think about the future of this discipline. And I'm really amazed that, given the spectrum of people with whom I've spoken, and it's a large range. Remember, I studied with people like Simon, I drink with Chapin, I've worked with Peter, I was a postdoc of Rainey Das, and I know Jed and Diana and Noel and Modi and all the groups that many of you here, that all of them, save one, were rather pessimistic. Which I found because these were, seriously the leaders of the field. The one person who was infinitely smarter than I, who was optimistic for an interesting and correct reason. And that was, this person reminded me that the history of science is more popular now with other disciplines than it was back when I was young, when the Vikings still hadn't won a Super Bowl, right? Now, as I told this person, well, that's a good thing and a bad thing, because it depends upon what it is other disciplines are taking from us and whether they need us in order to get what they want to get. And that's a different story. The moral to my story is that even though I was a molecular biologist in a previous life and then was visited by 3 ghosts, interdisciplinarity can be wonderful or great, or more often than not to coin a Jed term, it can be horseshit. And this is where we need to be careful. And so the moral to this story is an easy one. We just need to remember we're historians. No more, no less. We can take tools from whoever we want. I steal a technique I play the cello from a violinist. That does not make me a violinist. I'm a cellist. I'm a card-carrying proletariat cellist, right? So we can use different tools from different fields, but just remember we're historians. And if the tool doesn't fit, because the archive doesn't say it is, kick the tool through the goalposts of life, Jesus. That's actually a song. Not the tools bit, but the kick me through the goalposts of life bit. So I want to go briefly I want to engage with what went on in the last 2 days. And I want to start by Moshe's point. Moshe is correctly present. And that is, he was interested in situating, which never came back, the internalist, and I'm using scare quotes, of the history of science, with the externalist, vis-a-vis the externalist. And he talked about approaches in cultural studies. He talked about approaches in gender studies. And he wanted to know, was there a field that was having a similar splintering for similar reasons? I work on musicology stuff. I'm not a musicologist, nor have ever played one on TV, but there's a similar debate in musicology. Noel, you have to close your ears because what I'm about to say I don't believe, because Noel's a musicologist, but I write letters for people at major universities in musicology for tenure and in promotion. And I've been always told that, Miles, remember, a musicologist doesn't need to know anymore the difference between A minor and C major. I know Noel, the actors categories, Noel, okay? But that person could be working on the importance of music to fin de siècle of Vienna, for example, right? So there's a similar debate going on in other fields that are going into ours. I just briefly wanted to historicize, because that's what I do when I pick up my check. Going back to the internalist, externalist, and Diana mentioned this at her talk, it kind of reminds me of bad music, right? I mean, we had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun. I don't want to use those terms anymore. I don't think we should. I don't think they've been used anymore. It was the time it was territoriality, right? It was you can work on this and you can work on that. And if you're a philosopher and scientist, you work on internal, and if you're a sociologist, you work on external, and it was sniff and pissed. And I'm on camera, I know, but I'm gonna say it, right? Let's get away from that. And I thought that in the 80s, it was trying to get away from that in important ways. So I'm gonna quote Reagan, the only time I'll quote a Republican for a good reason, which is, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The reasons why the wall was taken down. But much like the Berlin Wall coming down, there were interesting ramifications of that move in our discipline as well, right? So with it, I always stress to people that, many of us were interested in understanding the context of scientific knowledge with a view to understand how scientific content was determined. Now that predicates a knowledge of the content. That's not tricky argument. The problem is a next generation of scholars decided to use those techniques and do an end run around content. And they put different fields, put different jargons. In a sense, different walls were reconstructed. So to take, the Germans hopefully will laugh, to take another phrase from someone in politics I didn't necessarily agree with, let's say Walter Ulbricht, the first head of the German Democratic Republic, with his Saxony accent. Niemand hat die Absicht, eine Mauer hier zu errichten. Ne? No one had the view of building a wall, but walls came about because, again, many disciplines not so interested in scientific content were using our tools in ways that bothered me. And I'm reminded, and I defer to people in Germany who see this every day, it's the difference between Wissensgeschichte and Naturwissenschaftsgeschichte, right? In which Wissensgeschichte doesn't have to ignore scientific content, but it has been doing just that. So that when it gets used, it's seen as doing an end run from the type of labor we've always done to understand the frickin' science. And that I see as a problem. Again, there is nothing epistemologically an epistemological necessity that you have to ignore the scientific context for Wissensgeschichte, but that seems to have been the case, particularly in Germany. What about so that's the past in 30 seconds or less. What about the future, since clearly historians are so good about this? I want to bring in Mary's integrative approach that you mentioned earlier today. Because I do believe we can bring in skills in tools, forms of knowledge, not to coin a phrase, from various fields. I don't want to be prescriptive. It's not my shtick, right? I like telling stories. I like writing and reading interesting stories. Diana's point about writing is so critical to this discipline, where other disciplines aren't nearly. That's one thing we should, as historians, do really, really well. The other ones just want to pull out your hair and say, oh, Lord, love a duck, right? But I've always wanted to contextualize science with views to understand, as I said, its content. And so I personally am interested in stories and narratives during periods in which categories of thought are not well established, i.e. they're under dispute or they're blurred. Why? Because I'm interested in researching themes which tie together science with other forms of culture, when the argument is that they're actually very deeply related, and then historicize that moment. So to give examples of the kinds of stuff that resonated with me, Sharon talking about earlier today, Larry Principe's scholarship, Bill Newman's scholarship, that historians can uncover really important knowledge doing actual experimentations to link together alchemical experiments with historical episodes in coded languages. Or Kathy Olesko, I can quote Kathy on this from a conversation we had kindly on my paper, a week ago, I guess it was, right, 2 weeks ago, that the notion of precision, that precision is a concept about physics and technology, but also about German culture, and it's important in the 1920s. It's an important theme in both areas. Liebe Taub's referencing of Modi and Jed's work on the relationship between, and Bill Newman's, of course, natural theology, Newton, and natural philosophy. Rob Iliff, who has a different take on that subject. I'm also fired up about history of objects, Theodore's kind of enterprise, his work on the history of electrons. I've always been fascinated by reed pipes and lenses, and I'm fascinated by people like David Pantalone, who's an historian who can glean information from artifacts, from tuning forks. He has an amazing historical skill to reconstruct who did what when by looking at the object itself and the marks on the instrumentation. I'm interested in the various forms of communicating knowledge historically, not just the written text. That's why I like redoing. That's why, as I said yesterday, I'm interested in replicating experiments or not replicating experiments, as the case may be. I don't think Graham is here, but I wanted to pick up on what Graham had to say. He referenced Bourdieu habitus. Bourdieu, if you drink enough bourbon, makes sense. God knows I've read him so many times. I want to die. He's a very bright man, and he needs to be read at least once. But there's a way in which I think we can take what Graham said and historicize it in interesting ways. Look at the body. Look at concentration. Look at experimental techniques. Because Graham took the quote, "Attention catalyzes awareness into action." There's actually a discipline of physiology and neurophysiology that did precisely that in the late 19th and early 20th century. It also included psychophysics and psychophysiology. The actors were Charcot, Duchamp, Wundt, Fechner, Weber, Ferré, Mallet, Ottmann, and Bernstein. It included countries such as France, Britain, Germany, back in the USSR, and the United States. One classic example is and what I'm talking about in particular is the way in which these physiologists and neurophysiologists measured the touch of a pianist with the view of cultivating technique. And the physiologists studied pianists in their laboratory. Marie Jael, a very well-known pianist, student of Liszt, most famous for her work on pedagogy, worked in the lab of Charles Ferré on quantifying touch. And her works were very important in France, and they get translated by not a great pianist, but a very important physician by the name of Albert Schweitzer, of all people. So this is a story about physiology, about touch, about taste, about pedagogy, and about physiology. They're interrelated in fascinating ways at this time. Other examples that I get fired up about, I look at Berlin was the place to live until 1933. In the 20s and 30s, looking at the research of physicists and radio engineers on acoustical formats. As boring as that sounds, and at times it's really freaking tedious, and looking at more electronic circuits than I ever want to see for the rest of my life, it's fascinating because they're interested in improving the transmission of radio broadcasting. You have wonderful letters in the archives in Berlin at it was the Conservatoire, the Hochschule für Musik, in which you get very upset German men and women who are older saying how dare they have a broadcast of Beethoven's Heiliger Dankgesang string quartet in which the violin was replaced by a clarinet. You're saying, oh my God, Germans would never do that. And it turns out they didn't, but it was very difficult to broadcast with fidelity the overtones of a violin so that it sounded like a violin, right? It sounded more like a clarinet. So physicists and radio engineers had that homework assignment. What's the context? It's important to know what country you're going to attack when. There's a political context to this, whether you like it or not, but there's also a musical context. Because it turns out by looking at these formats, you can understand tone color, you can play with adding circuits at certain frequencies to mimic the tones of different instruments. That's what the Trautonium did, a famous electronic musical instrument. So it's a story about marching through format theory in the 1920s and 30s, including Harvey Fletcher, by the way, at Bell Labs, on the one hand, and looking at a taste of music, a new aesthetic that's being created, a politics that included Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany, and also the post-war rise of, wait for it, electronic music. Because it's going to be that Trautwein, who created the Trautonium, who will work with a guy called Werner Meyer-Epple, who is a physicist and information theorist, to form the Institute for Electronic Music in Cologne. that happened to host a young lad who was very impressed with this by the name of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, right? So to say what's the internal and what's the extra, I don't know, because at this moment, everything is up for grabs, and that's what makes it so much fun. Other quickly, big data and algorithms and single nucleotide polymorphisms of DNA. What makes us different as human beings? There's amazing work being done now by molecular biology and computer scientists on this particular issue. So on the one hand, there's a debate about whether or not algorithms, there's also a debate about whether or not algorithms should be patented, if they're legitimate patents. If they're not, Ancestry.com and 23andMe are in really, really big trouble, because this is a story about advertisement, this is a story about race and ethnicity, this is a story about ethics at the same time as it is one about a fascinating moment in biology where we have amazing amount of data and what can we do to talk about differences between humans for migration patterns, for healthcare, with fascinating political, socioeconomic overtones. I also think of the work being done in synthetic biology, and I think of the Anthropocene. I think of synthetic biology as being both a tool and a subject of study for precisely that bit. And finally, the last example I'll give is that I was always fascinated by work between Kopfwerk and Handwerk, between intellectual and manual labor. And yeah, I've got to name the old man because he was my Doktorvater. I mean, everyone talks about the pump. Everyone talks about Newton's prism glass works. I think Schaffer's greatest contribution to the field is Babbage and the relationship between intellectual labor and hand labor, mechanization of labor, measurement of efficiency, lest we forget Babbage writes economic doctrines at this time, and Margaret will defend me more on this than I can defend myself. He also is interested in things such as quantifying, analytical and difference engines classically. Marx famously picks up on the Babbage principle for the alienation of labor. So it's a story about mathematics, the economy, replacement of labor. It's about human-machine interactions. It's about AI. All of this is up for grabs at all points. And again, I'm going to return to that because I'm near done, to return to my point. What the hell do we do as historians? We tell stories. We tell hopefully interesting stories. And we also show that nothing is inevitable. Everything is always, at one point, up for grabs. So we have to understand that where we are now is a product of scientific, economic, sociopolitical decisions. And it is our obligation to uncover just that. And precisely because of that, and what Jürgen had mentioned, that's why we need the longue durée. I, as an electron, have my lowest ground state in microstories. But I'm the first to admit we need longue durée stories, right? And Rainey Daston has always been seen as a key player, and she is. And I just want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend Jessica Riskin's Restless Clock. It's a brilliant story, I think, about the history of AI and machines-human interactions over 4 centuries. So that's the kind of stuff that fires me up. So to conclude, it strikes me that we need to find a balance to keep our disciplinarity, to understand the context of science upon which we're working, and at the same time, we need to party with general historians, using their tools and share, as Sharon rightly says, to contextualize that scientific knowledge, to show the development of scientific knowledge is not inevitable, as no formation of knowledge is. It's the result, as I said, of historical outcomes. We are morally, I think professionally and morally obliged to write and tell those types of stories for our colleagues, for ourselves, and for the public. And that's where the public understanding of science, which is not our strongest suit but really needs to be improved, as Sharon said, maybe because the acronym is PUS, we don't want to touch it, but it's very important, more now, I think, than ever in our so-called, at one time, true republic, which we're not anymore. And we also need to police their misuse, right? Join with our colleagues from all disciplines to fight against those who purposely misuse our knowledge production. Because we can't sit there and say, we just told the stories, you do with them what we want. I mean, we can't absolutely control reception. I understand reception theory, but we can do more than we have done. Because in the end, a hell of a lot is at stake. That's all I got. Thank you for your time. Questions, or it's also like the group finale, right? I mean, I'm not dodging my question.
Do you see any likelihood of a revival of the sociology of science, and if so, what will it look like?
I'd like to have that bourbon now. No, not the way we had it. I don't want to do the 70s again, right? That was disco, right? That was bad. I mean, to be fair, I mean, I do think the bit on cultural relativism, I worked in that tradition. I don't subscribe to that, and I think most of the historians I know who were influenced by people like Bloor do not do that. We're no longer in the Bloor moment. Where do I see interesting things from sociology generally defined? Things about ways of the hand, things about the ways in which certain gestures are conducted. I mean, that's the thing that fascinates me. I mean, how is it that various professions communicate their knowledge in nonverbal ways, right? From playing, for example, a guitar or playing the piano. There's a lot of very good sociological studies on touch that I, as a historian, say, well, that's interesting. I'm going to go to the archive with this tool and let's see if it indeed bears fruit or not. And if it doesn't, I'll just drop kick it. That I have absolutely no problem with. I mean, the always thing, you know, I take various tools to the archive, and if the tool doesn't work, you know, the idea is not to be Stalin and say, I'm now going to change the archive so that my tool works. That's generally a bad thing. But I think, so my answer to the show, I don't want to do SSK anymore. You know, been there, done that, and you know. But I would still draw upon very serious sociological analyses to see if it makes sense historically, absolutely. And I hope we continue to do that. And not to cultural anthropology, philosophy, that's fine. As long as we remember as a ground state, we're historians. Bourbon time, bourbon. Yep, uh-oh. John, I fear your question most of all. You're like the ghost of Christmas future. Here we go.
There is another bit of the end running that I think is very damaging to our discipline. Can you hear me? Yeah, which is damaging. And that is people who don't know the other part of the equation. For example, people who do sociology of science without knowing any sociology, who do, okay. So, come to a question, or anyway, something on which you might reflect. It was useful for the profession, just after the war, to distinguish itself from other specialties in history. It opened the doors of the National Science Foundation, for example, and it provided, on specious grounds, for our hiring in a number of departments in history, history and philosophy, and history of science. Question, do you think that intellectually that was a good thing, this isolation, and do you think it would be an even better thing if we dropped the wall altogether, admitted that we were historians, chose our topics as we please without having to look over our shoulders, and to try to determine in what cell we belong?
Like I said, Father Ghost of Christmas future, I think your question. It's a very good question, John. In the end, I believe in intellectual integrity and say, I don't want people, I want to do what it is I do, right? On the other hand, I understand there's realpolitik, and that historians want to hire historians, and sociologists want to hire sociologists, right? In a perfect world, we get the administration on side with our intellectual interests. So I will defer to how one does that. Since you've played a university administrator, the university would collapse if I ever would try to do something like that. But to answer to your question, I understand it's what I've tried, you know, when I was at NYU and able to usurp some of the hires, that some of the things I had to do were to cut corners on what I wanted to do only to help colleagues who are smart get jobs. Am I sorry I did that? No. I wish I lived in a perfect world. I wish I could basically say, I do this, I'm a historian, and if they, you know, if the sociologists are pissed off with me, I'll live to see the next day. If an historian says, Miles, I don't see that in the archive, I need to really rethink of what it is I do. So in a perfect world, I want to do what it is I want to do without someone looking over my shoulder saying that's not really what it is you should be doing. But in the other world, the realpolitik is that precisely. I mean, The historical moment is that you wanted to argue for the uniqueness of the scientific knowledge in order to create positions. And I think that's one of the reasons why you had this external-internal debate, that it fed into institutional distinctions in rather critical ways that enabled the development in interesting ways of the discipline. So I want my cake and eat it too, but in the end, I don't want someone to overlook my shoulder and say, that's not quite what we consider that is that you're supposed to be doing. But in order to do that, we need to live in a res publica literarum which never existed, in which we're able to do that. Does that answer your question, John? Or? Yeah, no, I mean, so that's, in the end, I want to do, because look, if I wanted to be rich, I would drive a BMW and listen to what the corporation wanted. I don't. I dress like this. And as a result of that, I want to do what it is that interests me as a human being. And if other people don't like it, I have permission to drop my drawers and moon people, and that's what Diana said. But the key is, and the apolitik is, I want to help young scholars. And I feel morally obliged to help young scholars because older scholars have helped me in my lifetime. And that might require selling one's soul to the devil, but since I did read a lot of Goethe, I'm fine because Faust too saves me.